There are exactly 400 seats in the main auditorium of the Palladium. I know this because I counted them on my second night. I didn't count them because I was bored though. God knows a 12-hour shift in an abandoned building is boring. I counted them because the silence in that place is so heavy it feels like it has physical weight, and I needed something, anything, to keep my brain from eating itself alive. The Palladium is a rotting jewel in the middle of downtown Detroit, a 1,920 seconds Art Deco theater that's been scheduled for demolition since I was in high school. It's a massive, hulking thing of crumbling brick and shattered glass. The city finally approved the teardown last month, but until the wrecking balls swing in November, the insurance company requires a physical human presence to prevent arson. That's me. I'm the physical human presence. The pay is $22 an hour, cash, which is the only reason I took a graveyard shift in a building that smells like 50 years of stale cigarette smoke and wet wool. Don't go into the basement. The site supervisor, a nervous guy named Miller, had told me during the walkthrough on October 1st. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. Flooding. Structural issues. Just stick to the lobby in the main house. Walk the perimeter every hour. Keep the squatters out. He handed me a heavy mag light and a set of keys that felt freezing cold against my palm. He left quickly. Too quickly. My first shift was 3 days ago. It was mundane, but oppressive. The electricity is cut, so the only light comes from the street lamps filtering through the boarded-up windows and the beam of my flashlight. The auditorium itself is the centerpiece. It's a cavernous space with a high domed ceiling where the paint is peeling off in long dead strips that look like skin. And then there are the seats. 400 of them, arranged in a perfect fan shape, upholstered in velvet that might have been red once but is now the color of dried blood. On that first night, walking the aisles at 11 p.m., I felt it immediately. You know that feeling when you walk into a room where two people have just been screaming at each other and they stop the second you enter? The air feels thick, static. The Palladium felt like that, but empty. I walked down the center aisle, my boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The air was freezing colder than outside. I shined my light across the rows. Row A through row T. 20 rows, 20 seats each. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam, swirling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. I sat in the security booth at the back of the house, trying to read a paperback, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked up, my eyes were drawn to the stage. The heavy velvet curtain was down, moth-eaten and heavy, hiding whatever was behind it. At 3:45 a.m., I did my required rounds. I walked the perimeter of the auditorium again. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise from outside, no settling of the building, just a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. I swept my light over the seats one last time before heading back to the lobby. Row A, empty. Row B, empty. Row C. I paused. The beam of my light caught a dust sheet draped over seat C14. I hadn't noticed a dust sheet there before. I frowned, stepping closer, squinting into the gloom. It wasn't a sheet. It was just a trick of the light on the faded velvet. I shook my head, exhaling a breath that misted in the cold air. "Get a grip, Mike," I whispered. My voice sounded too loud, too intrusive. I turned away, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling, the primal, lizard brain instinct, that the moment I turned my back, the room changed. I finished the shift without incident, but when I got home to my cramped apartment at 7 a.m., I scrubbed my skin in the shower until it was raw. I couldn't get the smell of that place off me. It smelled like old flowers and copper. I needed the money, so I went back the next night, and that's when I started counting. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. on my third shift, when the counting stopped making sense. I had developed a system to keep my nerves steady. Every hour, I'd walk the perimeter of the auditorium, shining my light row by row, mentally checking them off. Row A, clear. Row B, clear. It was a grounding exercise, a way to tell my overactive imagination that there was nothing in the dark except dust and rot. I was standing at the top of the left aisle, near the emergency exit that leads to the alley. The rain was hammering against the roof outside, a dull, rhythmic thumping that sounded like someone drumming their fingers on a table. Inside, the air was dead still. I clicked my mag light on to its highest setting, a bright, focused beam that cut through the gloom like a knife. Row A, empty. Row B, empty. Row C, occupied. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. I froze, the flashlight beam wavering slightly in my trembling hand. There was someone sitting in seat C14. My first thought was squatter. Miller had warned me about them. Junkies or homeless kids looking for a dry place out of the rain. But my second thought, the one that made my stomach drop, was that he didn't look like any squatter I'd ever seen. He was sitting bolt upright, spine rigid against the back of the chair. Even from 20 feet away, in the spill of the flashlight, I could see he was wearing a suit. A tuxedo, actually. The fabric looked black and expensive, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. His hair was slicked back, shiny and dark. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead, fixed intensely on the closed stage curtain. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice cracked, echoing hideously around the dome. "You can't be in here! This is private property!" Nothing. Not a flinch. Not a twitch of the shoulder. He sat as still as the statues in the lobby. I took a step forward, my hand drifting to the pepper spray on my belt. "Sir, I need you to leave. Now." I took another step. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a loud, protesting creak. The man in C14 didn't react. It was like he couldn't hear me, or worse, like I didn't exist. I was 10 feet away now. I could see the collar of his white shirt. I could see the pale, waxy skin of his neck. He looked solid, real, but there was a wrongness to him. He was too still, no rise and fall of shoulders for breath. "I'm calling the police." I bluffed, raising the flashlight to aim it directly at his face. I wanted to blind him, to force a reaction. I snapped the beam up. The circle of white light hit seat C14. It was empty. I gasped, stumbling back a step, almost tripping over my own boots. I swept the light, left, right, behind the seat. Nothing. The auditorium was completely empty. "What the hell?" I whispered. I forced myself to walk down to row C. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses. I reached out a shaking hand to seat C14. The red velvet cushion was depressed. It wasn't dust-covered like the seats next to it. It was pressed down, as if a weight was still resting there. And when I brushed my knuckles against the fabric, it wasn't just cold. It was freezing. A sharp, biting chill that burned my skin like touching dry ice. I backed away, keeping my light trained on the empty seat until I hit the back wall. I spent the rest of the night locked in the security booth with my back to the door, staring at the monitors that showed nothing but static. I told myself I was tired. I told myself it was a trick of the shadows. But I knew what I saw. And deeper down, I knew that seat C14 hadn't just been occupied. It had been claimed. I spent the entire next day lying in bed, staring at my ceiling fan, trying to diagnose myself with something rational. Carbon monoxide poisoning? Sleep deprivation? Psychosis? Stress? I googled visual hallucinations caused by mold and read 3 different medical articles. I convinced myself that the old ventilation system in the theater was pumping out something toxic. So, I bought a high-grade respirator mask from the hardware store on my way to work. I looked ridiculous, like I was going to handle hazardous waste, but I didn't care. If it was just bad air, the mask would fix it. I unlocked the side door at 10 p.m. The smell hit me instantly, even through the filters of the mask, that heavy, wet sweetness. It was stronger tonight. I stayed in the lobby for the first few hours, pacing circles on the cracked marble floor. I turned the volume up on my phone, listening to a podcast to drown out the silence. But every time the podcast host laughed, the sound died instantly in the air, swallowed by the building. 1:59 a.m. I felt the pull. It was physical, like a hook in my gut tugging me toward the auditorium doors. I checked the time on my phone. The numbers seemed to hang there. 1:59. "Just check," I whispered into my mask. "Check. Confirm it's empty, and then you can leave. You can just walk out." I pushed the double doors open. The auditorium was vast and swallowed in shadow. I kept my flashlight off at first, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The faint orange glow from the streetlights outside filtered through the high, boarded windows, casting long skeletal shapes across the rows. I looked at row C. My breath hitched in my throat, hot and damp against the inside of the mask. C14 was occupied. The man in the tuxedo was back. Same rigid posture, same slicked back hair, same terrifying stillness. But he wasn't alone. In seat C15, right next to him, sat a woman. I switched on my flashlight. my hand shaking so bad the beam danced wildly before settling on them. They didn't flinch. They didn't react to the sudden blinding light. The woman was wearing a dress I'd only seen in old photographs, a floral print with a high collar, something from the late 32nds or early 42nds. Her hair was pinned up in tight curls. She sat with her hands folded primly in her lap. "This isn't real," I choked out. But my eyes told me it was. And this is the part that messed me up the most. The part that made my knees feel like water. They weren't translucent. They weren't misty, Casper the ghost apparitions. They cast shadows. When I moved the light to the left, their shadows stretched out long and black against the empty seats of row D behind them. They blocked the view of the armrests. They had mass. They occupied space. I watched them for 10 minutes, terrified to move, terrified to look away. I watched for the rise and fall of a chest. I watched for a twitch of a finger. Nothing. They were statues made of flesh and fabric, and then I noticed their heads. They were tilted slightly upward, locked onto the center of the heavy red stage curtain. They weren't just sitting there, they were an audience. They were waiting for the show to start. I backed out of the room slowly, refusing to turn my back on them. As the door swung shut, cutting off my view, I had this sickening realization that I wasn't guarding the building from intruders. I was guarding the intruders from the outside world. I shouldn't have gone back. I know that now. But there is a sickness in curiosity, a morbid gravitational pull that overrides survival instincts. I needed to prove to myself that they were holograms, or mannequins, or a prank. I needed to touch them. It was my 4th night. The air outside was humid, unseasonably warm for October in Detroit, hovering around 60 degrees. But inside the auditorium, I could see my breath pluming in white clouds before my face. 2:03 a.m. I stood at the top of the aisle. They were there. The man in C14, the woman in C15, and now a third figure in C16, a younger man, maybe in his 20s, wearing a woolen flat cap and a drab gray coat. I gripped the mag light in my left hand and walked down the slanted aisle. Every step felt like pushing against a physical barrier, like wading into deep water. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to turn around, to quit. My stomach churned with bile. "Just touch him," I told myself. "Tap his shoulder. If he's real, you kick him out. If he's a ghost, your hand goes through, and you leave town." I reached row C. The temperature plummeted. It wasn't a gradual cool down. It was a violent thermal shock. The sweat on my forehead turned to ice instantly. My teeth started chattering so hard I had to clench my jaw until it ached. And the smell. Up close, it was suffocating. It smelled like a funeral home that had lost power for a week. Sickly sweet lilies masking the unmistakable copper tang of decomposition. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. But the smell seemed to coat the back of my throat. I stood directly behind seat C14. The man in the tuxedo was right there. I could see the individual pores on his neck. I could see the stiff starch of his collar. He was so real that I hesitated. What if this was just a guy? A very still, very cold guy. I reached out. My hand was trembling violently. "Hey," I whispered. I lowered my hand onto his right shoulder. I expected air, or maybe warm cloth. What I felt was marble. Freezing. Absolute zero stone. It was hard and unyielding. So cold it burned my fingertips like a hot stove. It felt dead. Not just inanimate, but anti-life. I gasped and tried to pull my hand back. But for a split second, the physics broke. The hardness gave way. My fingers didn't slide off. They sank into him. It felt like plunging my hand into a bucket of ice water and thick slime. The substance of his shoulder dissolved into a freezing mist that swirled around my wrist. I yanked my arm back with a shout, stumbling into the empty seats of row D behind me. I fell hard, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, flashing across the ceiling. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from them, clutching my right hand against my chest. My fingers were blue, numb, frostbitten. I looked up at them from the floor. They hadn't moved. The man in the tuxedo, the woman, the boy in the cap, they were all still staring straight ahead at the curtain. The shoulder of the tuxedo where I'd touched him was perfectly smooth again. But then, the man in C14 did something that nearly stopped my heart. He didn't turn his head. He didn't blink. But slowly, painfully slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Not a smile, It was a spasm, a glitch. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop running until I was in the parking lot, gasping for air that didn't taste like dead flowers. I didn't quit. I know. You're screaming at the screen, telling me I'm an idiot. But my bank account was overdrafted by $300, and fear doesn't pay the landlord. So, I compromised. I stopped doing floor rounds. I locked myself in the projection booth at the very top of the theater, a small concrete room behind thick, soundproof glass. It was the only place I felt safe. A week passed. The pattern was mathematical, inescapable. Every single night, at exactly 2 a.m., the count went up by 1. I watched through the grime-streaked glass of the projection window, using a pair of binoculars I found in the Lost and Found. It was like watching a slow-motion invasion. By Tuesday, row C was full, 20 people. By Friday, row D was half full. Through the binoculars, the scene was a nightmare collage of history. There was a soldier in a muddy World War I uniform sitting next to a woman in a 1,980 seconds power suit. A teenager in a Nirvana t-shirt sat beside a man in a Victorian frock coat. It didn't make sense. There was no chronological order to their arrival. It was random, yet perfectly organized. But it was their faces that made me nauseous. From the floor, I had thought they were just staring. From the magnification of the binoculars, I saw the truth. Their eyes were peeled wide open. Not just looking, straining. The whites of their eyes were yellowed and dry. No blinking, no moisture. And their mouths. Every single one of them had their mouth hanging slightly open. Not a scream, just slack-jawed. Like they were in a deep, hypnotic trance. It gave them all a stupid, vacant look that was infinitely worse than if they had been snarling monsters. They looked like lobotomy patients. I started making notes. I timed them. 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. They appear. They sit. They stare. 5:01 a.m. I look away for a second to check my phone, to wipe the fog off the glass, and they're gone. But on the 7th night of this new routine, I noticed something that made me drop the binoculars. I was focusing on a woman in row D, seat 8. She had long, stringy hair and wore a hospital gown. I was watching her jaw, the way it hung loose. Then, she breathed. It wasn't a human breath. Her chest didn't rise, but her mouth. It pulsed. It widened just a fraction of an inch, then relaxed. Then widened again. I moved the binoculars to the man next to her. He was doing it too. I scanned the row, all 30 odd of them. Their jaws were flexing in perfect unison. Open, shut, open, shut. Like gills, like they were filtering something out of the stale air. They weren't just watching the stage. They were feeding on the atmosphere. And the curtain, the heavy red velvet curtain on the stage. It rippled. There was no draft in the theater. The air was dead still. But the bottom of the curtain swayed, just once, as if something on the other side had brushed against it, sensing the audience was growing. Sound has a way of traveling in old theaters. They were built for it, designed to carry a whisper from the stage to the back row of the balcony without a microphone. But acoustics work both ways. It was Tuesday, 2:33 a.m. The count was up to 52. I was in the booth, door locked, reading a magazine, trying to ignore the rows of heads visible through the glass. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, static hissing sound. I paused, tilting my head. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like friction, like sandpaper rubbing against dry wood. I put my ear against the heavy glass of the projection window. The sound clarified. It wasn't sandpaper. It was whispering. It wasn't a few people chatting. It was the sound of a full house before the lights go down. That dull roar of hundreds of hushed conversations blending into one continuous frequency. But there were only 52 of them. I grabbed my keys and slowly, quietly cracked the booth door open just an inch. The noise hit me like a physical wave. It was deafening. A cacophony of frantic, overlapping whispers. Soon. Curtain. He sees. Open. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart hammering. I looked through the glass. Not a single mouth was moving. Their jaws were still doing that slow, rhythmic, pulsing open, shut, but their lips were frozen. The sound wasn't coming from their throats. It was coming from the air around them. I needed proof. I needed someone to believe me so I could get the hell out of this contract without being sued or arrested for abandoning my post. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I opened the voice memo app. Okay, I whispered to myself. Recording, October 18th, 2:40 a.m. I held the phone up to the gap in the doorframe for 30 seconds. The waveform on the screen spiked violently, capturing the roar of the whispers. I hit stop. I sat back in the chair, exhaling a shaky breath. Got you, I said. I got you. I pressed play, turning the volume all the way up. I didn't hear whispers. Through the tiny speaker of my phone, a completely different sound filled the small booth. It wasn't a voice. It was a wet, heavy, rhythmic thudding. Thump, thump. Silence, thump, thump. Silence. It sounded like a massive heart beating underwater. Slow. Powerful. I looked through the glass. I watched the jaws of the 52 entities. Open. Thump, thump on the recording. Shut. Silence. Open. Thump, thump. They weren't whispering. They were syncing. They were acting as a single organism. A collective battery charging up for something. And looking at the timestamp on the recording, I realized the heartbeat was getting faster. I tried to quit the next morning. I really did. I called Miller at 9 a.m., my voice raspy from lack of sleep. I told him I was sick. I told him I had a family emergency. I told him the building was unsafe. Read your contract, Mike, Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. Clause 4. Early termination requires a 2-week notice, or you forfeit your entire pay plus a penalty fee. You walk now. You owe us money. He hung up before I could argue. I checked my bank account balance. A negative $314.12. My rent was due in 3 days. If I quit, I'd be evicted. The horror in the theater was abstract. The horror of being homeless in Detroit in late October was very, very real. I went back. But this time, I broke the rules. I didn't just bring a flashlight. I brought a hammer. I brought a crucifix I bought at a pawn shop, even though I haven't been to church since I was 6. And I brought headphones, noise-canceling industrial ones I used to use for mowing lawns. I walked in at 10 p.m. The atmosphere had shifted. The heavy feeling wasn't just in the auditorium anymore. It had bled out into the lobby. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and contort when I wasn't looking directly at them. 2 a.m. came. I was in the booth, headphones on, blasting white noise. I refused to listen to the heartbeat. I refused to hear the whispers. I looked through the glass. 80 seats. Row A through row D were completely full. They were all there. The tuxedo man, the floral dress woman, the soldier, the teenager, and rows of new ones, a nurse covered in blood, a man in a soaking wet 1,950 suit, a child holding a headless doll. I squeezed my eyes shut. Ignore them. Just ignore them. But then I felt it. A vibration in the floor. I opened my eyes. They weren't looking at the stage anymore. 80 heads had turned completely around. 160 dead. Yellow eyes were staring directly up at the projection booth window. They were looking at me. My breath fogged the glass. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of their gaze. It wasn't angry. It was expectant. They looked like hungry dogs watching a butcher chop meat. Then, slowly, the man in the tuxedo, seat C14, the first one, raised his arm. He pointed a stiff, marble-white finger at the glass. Then the woman next to him did it. Then, the soldier. Within 10 seconds, 80 people were pointing at me. And then, through my noise-canceling headphones, I heard a voice. It didn't come from outside. It came from inside my own head, clear as a bell. Calm down, Mike. The show can't start without the usher. I ripped the headphones off and threw them across the room. I grabbed the hammer. I'm not coming down, I screamed at the glass. I'm not coming down there. They didn't lower their hands. They just kept pointing, and the curtain on the stage began to rise. Just an inch. Just enough to show the darkness underneath. I couldn't stand the gaze of those 80 pairs of eyes for another second. I backed away, crawling on the filthy floor of the projection booth, away from that damn glass window. My heart was beating so hard I could feel the pulse jumping in my throat. Behind the projection booth was a small office, which once belonged to the theater manager. It was full of dust and rotting papers. I rushed in, locked the door, even though I knew a rusty lock meant nothing to the things sitting down below. I needed to find out what was happening. Why me? Why Usher? I frantically rummaged through the old metal filing cabinets. Papers crumbled in my hands. An electric bill from $1,970. A cleaning schedule from $1,955. And then, in the bottom drawer, I found it. A thick, moldy leather notebook with faded gold embossed letters on the cover. Manager's Journal, 1,928. My shaking hands flipped open the yellowed pages. With the 10th of November, 1928, sold out. All 400 seats. Mr. Blackwood requested the emergency exits be sealed tight before the velvet curtain rises. He says it's part of the performance. I don't like this. The 11th of November, 1928. The handwriting becomes scrawled. Panicked. Accident. Fire? No, not fire. Structural collapse. But no one could get out. The doors were locked. No one got out. No one. I stopped breathing. The city's official history says the Palladium closed due to bankruptcy. No one mentioned any accident. No one mentioned 400 dead. I gathered all my courage, grabbed the flashlight, and went back to the projection booth. I had to check the emergency exits. I peeked through the glass one more time. The audience had turned their heads back to the stage. They were no longer pointing at me. But my relief was instantly extinguished by a new, colder horror. Along the auditorium walls, right in front of every emergency door with a faint exit sign, there were shadows standing. They were not like the seated audience. They had no detailed clothing, no clear faces. They were taller than normal people, maybe over 2 meters, gaunt and pitch black as if cut from the night itself. They stood motionless, hands clasped behind their backs, in a solemn, cold posture. Those were the ushers. I looked closely at the usher standing at the west emergency exit. It had no eyes, but I knew it was observing the entire auditorium. When an audience member in row D tried to lean to the side, that black shadow instantly slithered forward with impossible speed, placing a long black hand on that person's shoulder. The audience member immediately sat up straight, stiff as a statue. They weren't there to serve, they were there to keep order. And more importantly, they were there to ensure no one leaves before the show ends. I looked out at the corridor leading to the stairwell, my only escape from this floor. At the end of the hall, right in front of the stairwell door, a tall black shadow was standing. It had no face, but I could feel its attention focused on me. I was trapped. I didn't plan to sleep. Swear to God, I drank 3 cans of Monster and pinched my own thigh until it was bruised to stay awake. But the air in that manager's room, it wasn't just old. It was narcotic. It was heavy, sickly sweet, and made my lungs feel like they were filled with cotton wool. I collapsed right on top of the 1928 journal, my head hitting the hard wooden desk. When I jerked awake, my neck was stiff, and a puddle of cold drool stuck to my cheek. The space was silent. Absolutely silent. The black shadow in the hallway was gone, or at least I couldn't see it through the crack in the door anymore. I hurriedly checked my phone. 3:15 a.m. I had passed out for over an hour. I stood up, intending to rush to the door to check if the escape was clear, when I heard a rustling sound. The sound was coming from my own person. I reached into my uniform breast pocket. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat. My pocket was empty when I walked in here. I was sure of it. I tremblingly pulled the paper out. It was yellowed parchment, the same kind as the journal on the desk. The ink was still fresh, pitch black and wet, giving off a pungent chemical smell. The line was written in a slanted, ornate, sharp script. Full house soon. Prepare the spotlight, Mike. I dropped the paper as if it had just burned my hand. I grabbed the journal on the desk, flipping back to the entry for the 10th of November, 1928. I compared the handwriting. Identical. The hooks on the S, the slant of the O. The writer of this journal, the manager who died nearly a century ago, was just in this room. He stood right next to me while I slept. He tucked this paper into my pocket. I backed away, my back slamming hard against the wall behind me. This tiny room suddenly became as suffocating as a coffin. I wasn't alone in this room. I was never alone. I rushed out to the projection booth, pressing my face against the glass to look down at the auditorium. My stomach churned. It wasn't 80 people anymore. Row A to row J were packed tight. 200 entities. Half the theater was filled with corpses in suits, evening gowns, uniforms, and blood-stained clothes. 200 pitch-black heads, silent, motionless. But this time there was a change. They weren't sitting completely still anymore. Those 200 bodies were swaying slightly, very slightly. Left, right, like a field of dead wheat rippling before a thunderstorm. And center stage, the massive red velvet curtain was pulsating more violently, as if something massive inside was clawing, demanding release to start the show. "Prepare the spotlight," I mumbled, remembering the note. I looked over at the old control panel next to the projector. There was a large brass switch, covered in dust, labeled Spotlight Center. Someone had wiped the dust off that switch. A fingerprint was still fresh in the thick dust. I didn't want to touch that switch. My reason screamed to run away immediately, to smash the glass window and jump down if needed. But my body had betrayed me. My right arm, the arm that had once touched the shoulder of the man in seat C14 and been frostbitten, now raised itself as if pulled by an invisible fishing line. My trembling fingers placed themselves on the cold brass lever. Click. The sound of metal clashing rang out dryly in the silent space. Immediately, a low hum resounded, sounding like high-voltage electricity running through rotten wires. The smell of acrid burning dust rushed into my nose. From the projection port of the booth, a blinding, thick beam of white light shot straight out, cutting through the dense darkness of the auditorium like a blade of light. The circle of light shone directly onto the center of the red velvet curtain on stage. Below, 200 audience members held their breath in unison. The silence now was no longer emptiness. It was a suffocating anticipation. Under the harsh spotlight, I saw the velvet curtain was not still. It was twitching. Something massive was pushing from behind. It did not have a human shape. The protrusions on the fabric looked sharp, like elbows or knees, but their size and position were completely wrong. Here, it protruded a long way. There, it caved in deeply. And then, I heard a sound. It wasn't symphony music or actors speaking. It was a wet sound. The squelching of flesh rubbing together, mixed with the cracking of breaking bones. Reap. The curtain parted right in the center, where the light hit. Just a small gap, about half a meter. In that fateful tenth of a second, the light shone deep into the darkness behind the wings. And I saw the star of the show. It wasn't a monster. It was a cluster of people. Dozens, maybe hundreds of naked arms, legs, and torsos twisted together, melted and fused into a massive, chaotic mass of flesh. I saw a woman's hand growing out of the eye socket of a man's face. I saw gaping mouths fused onto heaving chests. They were all alive. And all the eyes on that disgusting mass of flesh. Dozens of jumbled eyes were staring blankly into the light, looking at me. "Turn it off," I screamed, my voice cracking with horror. I used both hands to yank the lever down hard. Click. The light vanished. The auditorium plunged into pitch-black darkness. But in the very moment darkness fell, I heard a sound even more terrifying than the image just now. 200 audience members below clapped in unison. Clap. 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 The applause was slow, steady, dry like bone hitting stone. And it got louder. Tonight is the last night. Tomorrow, at 6 a.m., the demolition crew's wrecking balls will smash this place to rubble. I should have felt relieved. I should have been at home, packing up and thanking God for surviving this week from hell. But I was still here. Not because I wanted to, but because when I tried to open the main door, to flee after the event in the projection booth, the doorknob was red hot like glowing coal, and blocking every exit were those tall, looming black shadows, the ushers. They didn't attack me. They just stood there, pointing toward the auditorium, silently ordering. The show is about to start. The clock strikes 11:58 p.m. I was herded into the main auditorium. The stench was gone, replaced by the strong smell of perfume, old makeup, and the burning smell of overloaded filament bulbs. The air was so cold, my breath turned into thick fog instantly. I stood at the end of the center aisle, clutching the hammer, the most useless weapon in the world right now. I looked down at the rows of seats. It was complete. Row A through row T. Every row, every seat, the suits, the floral dresses, the tattered uniforms, the blood-soaked pajamas. I didn't need to count anymore. I knew the exact number, 399. The whole theater was packed with motionless corpses, all sitting bolt upright, fixing their eyes on the red velvet curtain shuddering on the stage. There was only one empty seat left. Seat A1. Front row. Dead center. The seat with the best view. On the red velvet cushion of A1, something was placed. I squinted through the cold mist. It was my security cap. The cap I dropped yesterday. Suddenly, the noise cut out. The underwater heartbeat thump-thump stopped. Absolute silence enveloped the space, heavy enough to make my eardrums ache. And then, the most terrible sound I had ever heard rang out. Crack. 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 It was the sound of dry neck bones being twisted. 399 heads rotated 180 degrees in unison, not turning their bodies, only their heads spun backward. 798 cloudy, dry eyes pinned me down. They were no longer soulless. They were smiling. Smiles stretched ear to ear, revealing gray teeth. And all at once, 399 mouths moved, emitting a resonant whispering sound, loud as thunder rolling in my head. Take a seat. Take a seat. Take a seat. My legs stepped forward on their own. I couldn't control them anymore. I tasted iron in my mouth. Not the blood of those things, but my own. In a desperate attempt to regain control of my legs, I bit down hard on my tongue. The bite was so hard, I felt a piece of flesh tear away. Searing pain shot up to my brain, breaking that deadly hypnosis for a second. I stopped right at row B, just one step away from seat A1. On stage, the velvet curtain had been fully raised. Dear God. There was no band, no actors, only it. A massive monolith of flesh, reaching the ceiling, woven from thousands of twitching human body parts. Flailing arms, faces screaming in silence, all melted together into a pillar of raw, wet, red living matter. And right in the middle of that meat mass, there was a hollow indentation, a human-shaped void. It was waiting for the final piece. It was waiting for me. Sit down! 399 mouths behind me screamed, the sound tearing my eardrums. No! I screamed back, spitting a mouthful of fresh blood onto the dusty floor. I spun around, swinging the hammer in my hand with all my might. I didn't aim at the black shadows. I aimed at the left wall, where there was a window boarded up with rotting wood. An usher lunged forward, its long black arm lashing out at my chest. It felt like being hit by a block of ice. I flew back, slamming into the wall, ribs cracking. But the impact sent me exactly where I needed to be. I swung the hammer and smashed the rotting boards. Bam! Light. Not stage light, but the gray, weak light of an October dawn. Outside, the roar of excavator engines sounded like angelic music. The clock had struck 6 a.m. The brick wall at the back of the auditorium shook violently. The demolition wrecking ball had started its work earlier than expected. Screech boom. A large section of the wall collapsed, dust flying blindly, daylight flooding in like a waterfall. In that moment, I saw 399 audience members scream in unison, not from pain, but from rage. Their flesh began to crack and dissolve into ash under the sunlight. The meat mass on stage recoiled, screeching piercingly, before being buried under the rubble falling from the ceiling. I dragged myself out of the hole in the wall, falling onto the scrap pile outside, and passed out just as the construction site siren wailed. 6 months have passed. I live in another state, stocking shelves for a supermarket. Day shift. Always day shift. They found me in the rubble with 3 broken ribs and a shredded tongue. They said I was lucky not to be crushed to death when the building collapsed. They said I was hallucinating due to a methane leak from old pipes in the basement. I nodded. I agreed with them. I took the pills they prescribed, but they couldn't explain why. In the local police missing persons list for the last 90 years, there were exactly 399 names found in my journal, and they didn't know about the noise. Whenever I was in a room that was too quiet, or when I closed my eyes to sleep, I heard it again. Not screaming, but applause. Clap, clap, clap. The applause was slow, patient, and I knew, somewhere in the darkness, there was an empty seat still waiting for me. The show never ended. It was just intermission.